Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base Biotech podcast, and this is number 29, going out on October the 3rd. I'm not even going to mention how many days until Christmas. I'm still living in a bit of a daze after the trip to Lithuania was followed last weekend by a trip to Dublin to do some interviews based around medtech and sports tech, and that was all prior to the NFL game at Croke Park. I was lucky enough to get a media pass to the game. It wasn't the best NFL game that I've ever seen in person, but still nice to be there, other than the huge crowds at the game. Usually the media entrance is separate, but not here. Dublin felt a lot like Chicago without the skyscrapers last week, although obviously Dublin has somewhat older buildings. Even getting off the plane at Dublin Airport, the screens had ads for Heinz and Nerds and other US products, and the city itself was full of Americans and NFL merchandise. Some priceless interactions too that I won't go into here. Anyway, the NFL is not biotech, so we'll move on. Next week, it's NLS days in Sweden. Of course, some of the time this week was spent trying to find accommodation and flights for Sweden, and it was also spent fixing lots of technical issues and other kinds of things I didn't want to do, but had to. I'm sure you all know what that's like. Last week our guests were Andy Parker, CEO of Step Pharma, about CTPS1 and cancer, and we had a conversation with Michael O'Rourke, CEO of Ratio Therapeutics, about eye treatments, and a deal with Boehringer Ingelheim. This week we have two guests in one interview and one guest in the other. We're talking high blood pressure with George Medicine's CEO Mark Mallon, and then we have an in-depth conversation about radiopharmaceuticals with Jack Hoppin, CEO of Ratio Therapeutics, and John Babich, the company's CSO. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other suggestions or comments, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you're interested in advertising or sponsoring a podcast episode. Because of all the shenanigans in Ireland and all of the other things I was having to deal with, the news you may have missed section would be a little shorter this week, so I think we'll skip it altogether. Although there are some big news stories on there, so please definitely do go and have a look at deeptechdigest.com. So let's get straight to the reason why you're here, unless you thought Base to Base was a podcast about baseball. However, by now you've probably realised it's not about base stealing. First up this week we're talking about high blood pressure, which most baseball fans will know about as it's now the playoffs. High blood pressure is a huge problem globally and leads to all kinds of other issues. To tell us the extent of the problem and what's being done for treatments, we talked to the CEO of George Medicines, Mark Mallon. Hi Mark, thanks for joining us this week on the podcast, and I wonder if to get things started, you could fill me in on the story so far for George Medicines.
Yeah, so the story begins in the George Institute, which is a research institute in Sydney. And the Research Institute has a mission, unlike many other healthcare research institutes, focused on chronic diseases, not infectious diseases, and focused on trying to make a difference in health in low and middle income countries. And so, of course, they focus on cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. And they've always had a focus on trying to do a better job of leveraging polypills for these markets, because there was opportunities potentially to get lower costs, make compliance and adherence easier, make it simpler for patients, and maybe be able to improve healthcare. Out of that work on polypills and on cardiovascular came the concept that became GMRX2. And then ultimately they built and spun out George Medicines, a pharmaceutical company, because the Institute recognized that they're not a pharma company, and that they're going to take advantage of this new concept of GMRX2. They would need to set up a pharma company. And the key insight and the key innovation really that's different than other polypills or fixed dose combinations is the recognition that when you're treating hypertension, blood pressure lowering agents kind of have a flat response curve. You get an initial very strong response, lowering of blood pressure. But after that, those initial milligrams, very rapidly the response curve flattens, and you're not really getting much more efficacy, but you do pick up tolerability issues. And so we've known for a long time is that you're much better adding a new agent, a different mechanism. Like, if you're starting with a calcium channel blocker, adding a diuretic or an ARB, and vice versa, to improve blood pressure control while maintaining tolerability. But up until GMRX2, there's not really been any low or very low dose options to take advantage of this well-known phenomena. And that was the real breakthrough and insight around GMRX2. Now, thanks to the approval in the US, we have 3 doses, a standard dose of the 3 agents, which is telmisartan and ARB, amlodipine, the most common calcium channel blocker, and indapamide, the diuretic. And we have the standard dose, and then we have about half of the standard dose, and then we have a quarter of the standard dose. The hope is, because we know that most people will need multiple agents to get their blood pressure under control, but it usually takes people a long time to get there. The hope is, and which is what we'll see, that by having this half and quarter dose of the triple, it'll make it much easier to get people started faster on the 3 agents. They'll get the benefits of the better efficacy and also the tolerability. We've shown basically no difference in withdrawals for the dual versus standard monotherapy, or in the case of the quarter versus placebo. So really a great opportunity to make a big improvement in hypertension care, because actually, despite all our medicines, we don't do a great job in general in managing blood pressure. That's it, and wasn't quite 1 minute probably, but in like 2 minutes, there's the story of George Medicines and GMRX2.
Obviously, you mentioned that you're working on high blood pressure and hypertension. It's something that's relatively common, I guess, but could you give us maybe a bit of background on that and prevalence and what's currently used in its treatment?
Yeah, so high blood pressure is very prevalent with large percentages of adult populations around the world having that. What's interesting to note that, in the US and Europe, even those people being treated, less than half actually get to their target blood pressure. And, what is interesting is that, as you know, there are a number of effective approved medicines. I mentioned a couple of them. So, you have ACE inhibitors or ARBs, calcium channel blockers, diuretics. These are all common agents for using different mechanisms to reduce blood pressure. But because of the way historically we've treated, you starting with monotherapy and increasing the dose, and then at some point when you're not getting the result, then you add a new agent. But really, and we've become more clear over the last few years, and guidelines have started to change to show this, going up on the dose of one medicine is a kind of ineffective way to try to sort of increase your controlled blood pressure. You're much better off starting with a lower dose and adding a second or third mechanism to get really good blood pressure control and to do it with good tolerability. And blood pressure still is likely to be the number one killer in terms of diseases, chronic diseases. So 10 million people every year die of the consequences of blood pressure, which there are multiple really significant, right? Stroke is a major risk factor, blood pressure, high blood pressure is a major risk factor for stroke, heart attacks, heart failure. These are all leading killers. And, we can do much better on blood pressure control. As I mentioned, in the US, Europe, even half the people that are being treated are still not getting to the targets. And outside of the US and Europe, maybe only 1 in 4 people are actually getting to the target blood pressure.
Are there any mitigating factors with that? I mean, diet, lifestyle, those things that can assist with that other than medication?
Well, certainly diet, exercise, and other sort of, taking care of your health all have impacts on blood pressure. But as we've seen in many, whether we're talking about obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases, it can be hard to influence disease through lifestyle changes. You have to try to do those. And particularly once you've developed a condition, medicine is, often needed. The question is trying to come up with, and in many cases, more than one medicine. What we're trying to do with GMRX2 is get the three of the best medicines together in one pill, make it so you get the adherence benefits, you get the benefits of efficacy having the three excellent agents, but also make it really simple for physicians from a titration standpoint. Right now, they have too many options. With GMRX2, you can start with a quarter of the standard dose, a half of the standard dose, and then escalate. And we've seen in our studies, both from a pivotal standpoint and some pragmatic studies that we've done, we can get 70% or more people to their target blood pressure with GMRX2.
And I guess what we were talking about earlier that affects blood pressure is if you support a sports team in any capacity, that can massively affect your blood pressure.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't think we'll ever get an indication for controlling sports-induced high blood pressure. But for everybody else, we were very fortunate based on our great phase 3 program. We got a broad indication for management of hypertension. We're the first triple to be approved for initiation with therapy. So people can, as I said, much easier to get started on triple therapy quickly in their treatment journey.
I wonder if you could tell me a bit about Widoplic.
Yeah, Widoplic is the brand name. Yeah, the product has been approved in the U.S. on a basis of 2 phase 3 studies. One is a combination product, and so we took advantage of the 505(b)(2) pathway in the U.S. for using an abbreviated NDA to get approval. We took the triple combo and compared it to the 3 duals that would be made up of the 3 agents, and demonstrated that the triple is in fact better than any one of the 3 duals, and we showed around a 5-point better blood pressure lowering at the systolic level, the millimeters mercury. But beyond that requirement, sort of meeting the requirement for a combination product, we did also look at the quarter dose and the half dose versus placebo, because we wanted to try to get the ability to initiate with triple therapy, which has not been approved before. And with that, over time, we think more and more physicians will try to actually start right off with the 3 agents. And there are other diseases where now it's common to start up with multiple agents when the agents are safe, and we know that you need the benefit of multiple mechanisms. We think this is one of the things that will help us to get people under control better and faster than we've been able to do in the past, or at least can play a role in doing that.
And how does what you're doing kind of advance in many ways what is happening now?
There actually is a renewed focus on hypertension, which is great for us because we know we still aren't doing it good enough. Companies have mostly focused on what we call resistant hypertension, which is the people that have very high blood pressure that haven't responded to blood pressure medicines. But where we can fit in here is that actually, one, we know that many people that don't have resistant blood pressure are still not getting the blood pressure under control. And even 3 millimeters of blood pressure lowering can already reduce the risk of bad outcomes like heart attacks and stroke. So every millimeter of blood pressure reduction we can get that's done tolerably is important. The other thing is that many people were thought to have resistance, but actually I think we're finding out that they're just not taking their medicines, or they never actually achieved blood pressure control with effective use of existing medicines. And so again, Widoplic can be a cost-effective, simple way to get patients under control without having to use some of the newer, more expensive therapies that are going to be coming out. There's a couple of important features around GMRX2 I wanted to highlight. Obviously, we've got very strong efficacy. It's been demonstrated in our phase 3 program and some pragmatic studies. And we've got the broad indication for hypertension approved in the US and the first triple with initiation. But there's a couple of other important features. We do believe GMRX2 can be a portfolio in a brand, if you will, that there are multiple indication opportunities. And the first potential new indication is we have the George Institute is doing an outcome study in hemorrhagic stroke patients to see if we can prevent future or follow-on or recurrence of strokes in those patients. And so we can talk about how this actually can be a basis of additional indications beyond simple hypertension. And then the other important thing is that we've got a great partner in Piramal, an leading Indian generics manufacturer. And so we have very low cost of goods and very high quality product. And so we will have the flexibility to make this product available in low and middle income markets around the world, but even in the development markets, there are generic alternatives in treating hypertension. And so we're going to need to be cost competitive, and we've got the flexibility to be able to do that.
Does it have applications in other areas?
Well, in anything that where blood pressure plays a role, the product could potentially have a role to play. The first area that is being explored, or at a scale to potentially lead to an additional indication, is the prevention of recurrence of stroke in patients that have had a hemorrhagic stroke. As you're probably aware of, you have ischemic strokes, which are typically linked to some sort of a clot that triggers a blockage and then a stroke. And then you have hemorrhagic strokes, which are linked to bleeding in the brain. Those are rare, fortunately, but they can be very severe. And blood pressure lowering is a key treatment mechanism, but there's no approved therapy for sort of reducing the risk in patients that have had a hemorrhagic stroke. And so the Institute recognized that GMRX2 could be a very tolerable and very effective blood pressure lowering agent, and initiated a 1,600 patient outcome study that has been running for multiple years. And the average patient follow-up is 3 years. And it's basically the endpoint is looking at prevention of a second stroke after the initial hemorrhagic stroke. That will read out by the end of the summer, very soon in the next few weeks, and aiming to have results shared at the World Stroke Congress in October. We're confident, but you have to run the study to see the results. And so, if we get a good result, then this is something we have had discussions already with the FDA and other regulatory bodies, and we'll have a discussion whether this is something that could be included as an SNDA. There are other areas that we can go. We can think about adding a fourth blood pressure lowering agent to the GMRX2. We can think about adding other agents for treating things like diabetes, lipidemia. So there's a lot of ways we could build on this, either to tackle things like resistant hypertension or comorbidities like diabetes.
So could you tell me a bit more about your clinical trials to date?
So the program started with a phase 2 program, a study that was called Triumph, that looked at this type of a triple at the half dose level versus standard of care. It was a study run in Sri Lanka, which basically showed that we were getting 10 points better blood pressure control in up to 70% of the people to their target blood pressure with the GMRX2-like regimen. A different diuretic was used. Based on that proof of concept, as I said, the George Institute set up George Medicines and initiated this 2 phase 3 program study. One being looking at the 3 different doses of GMRX2, standard dose, half dose, and quarter, versus basically the 3 different dual combinations. So say telmisartan plus amlodipine, and telmisartan plus indapamide, and amlodipine plus telmisartan. And the study was conducted globally, multiple countries. Basically, everybody was randomized. There was a run-in period. Everybody was put onto the half dose of the GMRX2, stabilized, and then randomized to either the triple dose of GMRX2 or one of the 3 dual combinations that are made up of the same products. In addition to that, we also ran a study that looked at the quarter and half dose versus placebo, so that we could hopefully have the basis not only for use on people requiring multiple blood pressure lowering medicines that have been treated already, but also patients that are being initiated on therapy.
And could you tell me a bit more about the FDA approval?
Very happy with the outcome of the FDA process. So, we have the data from the 2 phase 3 studies in the label. We got the broad indication for treatment of hypertension. So basically anybody that would require more than one agent can use GMRX2 Weetablik in the US. As I said, we are the first triple now that has an indication for initiation in therapy for treatment of blood pressure. All 3 doses were approved. The other thing that we're happy about, we have a shelf life of 36 months. So this will make it a long enough shelf life that it certainly can be distributed to the typical channel in the US for getting the medicines to patients.
How important is pricing and accessibility? Because you mentioned launching in places other than the typical, US, Europe, Japan.
Mm-hmm. Wherever you are, pricing and access is important. The level can vary from country to country, but in some markets, in Europe, in Asia, the monthly price or cost can be as low as $10 to $20 a month or equivalent in local currency for blood pressure treatments. And so this is very different than sort of where you have the expensive new innovative therapies coming in. And basically this is going to provide access because of our ability to cost price even at those levels. We can make a more, a very potent blood pressure lowering agent with an excellent tolerability profile available around the world and accessible. When we did the research in the US, we had good feedback from payers saying that they could see the value, the rationale for the product.
Are there other things that you're working on in the pipeline?
We've got kind of a 3-horizon strategy as a company. Horizon 1 is really maximizing GMRX2. We need to get it approved and launched around the world. We need to make sure that physicians are taking it up. I should note that the timing is perfect because there's a movement now to actually lower the target blood pressure people should be shooting for. So the last year, 2024, the European Society of Cardiology reduced their target blood pressure from 140 over 90, the systolic and systolic, to 130 over 80, and for more patients at that lower target, and also recommended earlier use of combination therapy. And we expect the American Heart Association to do the same thing. So the timing for bringing something like GMRX2 is right. And so our first horizon or phase is maximize GMRX2. Second phase would be bringing out then hopefully some line extensions, like a stroke indication, like maybe getting an indication for treating resistant hypertension, and adding agents to be able to treat comorbidities. And if we're successful in those first two phases, we've kind of proven this idea of thinking smartly about dosing of existing generic medicines and putting together in ways that hadn't been done before could be a reasonable business model. And then we can start to look at there are other disease areas outside of hypertension where this type of thinking could be applied. And that would be the third horizon. Job one is really, there's so much unmet need in hypertension. And we think GMRX2 is such a great option that we've got to really try to maximize that first. And that's what the next couple of years are going to be about. I just wrap up by saying, despite having great medicines for reducing blood pressure, a lot of people still aren't getting to the targets, whether they're for sure if they're not being treated, but even if they are being treated. We know that many people do need 3 or more different types of ways of lowering blood pressure to really get to their target. The challenge is how do you make that more available to patients? And we think GMRX2 can make that happen because of having the first quarter and half dose options, having it in a simple titration option of just 3 doses, having the excellent medicines together in a single pill, improving adherence. And with that titration schedule, you can really get a large percentage of people controlled quite quickly. So it's not going to be the only solution. We do need new and innovative medicines that are coming forward. But GMRX2, I think, can play a role in helping do a much better job in managing blood pressure.
We tend to think of all the big ticket items when it comes to biotech and treating diseases, whether that's cancer or the many rare diseases out there. But some of the more common issues are the hardest to tackle, or they aren't considered lucrative enough. So, high blood pressure, given its connection to obesity, strokes, and heart attacks, among other conditions, is a massive global issue. So it's great that George Medicines is taking it on, and doing it well. Now, moving along, we're going to have an in-depth conversation about radiopharmaceuticals. It's a field at the intersection of nuclear medicine and precision therapy. One company hoping to turn that intersection traffic light to green is Ratio Therapeutics. Jack Hoppin, CEO of the company, and John Babich, the Chief Scientific Officer, are leaders in the space, and they're our guests on the podcast today to talk about the field in general and what Ratio is doing in oncology. So, thanks so much for being with us on the podcast, and maybe to start you could give us a bit of background on the field itself and also an introduction to yourselves.
Jack Hoppin, co-founder with John of Ratio Therapeutics, mathematician by training, have worked in nuclear medicine and pharmaceutical research my whole career. John?
John Babich, co-founder with Jack, a chief scientific officer, background in pharmaceutical chemistry, been in the nuclear medicine field my whole career as well, both in academia and the industry side.
Overview of the radiopharmaceutical field. Yes, so radiopharmaceuticals are not a new notion. Radioactive iodine 131, was first put in patients in the 50s and later received FDA approval. It's still the standard of care for thyroid cancer, as radioactive iodine naturally is scavenged by the thyroid and it ablates it. We've seen a rise, of which John was a participant in, and we've have worked in the field for a long time with some approvals back at the turn of the century in the early noughts with two treatments for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that were effective but weren't adopted. And then that kind of set the field back a little bit. Meanwhile, the field marched on and a lot of things came about: better imaging, better technology, better medicinal chemistry. And we saw two drugs now, Lutathera and Pluvicto, come online, as well as in 2013, Xofigo, just radium chloride, analogous to the radioactive iodine, just naturally taken up in osteoblasts and bone metastases. And these are exciting drugs in the sense that you are, instead of using external beam radiation therapy, which is very common standard of care, to irradiate with gamma rays a tumor, that doesn't work as you have metastases. Here, we're putting the radioactive isotope, typically radiometal, on a small molecule or another moiety, injecting it intravenously with a goal of optimizing the therapeutic index of the radiation of the tumor to the off target. That's thus the name of the etymology of our company's name, the Ratio Therapeutics. So we've seen over the last 8 years a massive influx of capital and effort as these drugs have been doing well. They have oddly quite often nominal side effects relative to chemotherapeutics and in some cases immunotherapeutics. And it's an exciting time in radiopharmaceuticals as everything's kind of come to a head, and we see a massive explosion of drug programs, not just for somatostatin and PSMA, for which Lutathera and Pluvicto were approved, but a myriad of other targets, including the ones we're working on at Ratio.
Maybe add a little bit more color, right? The field has advanced dramatically from, prior, let's say 1990, with the advent of very sophisticated PET imaging, ubiquitous cyclotrons. Now, this used to be limited to national laboratories. Then it became, there's a cyclotron in certainly every huge major university. Then they're basically in the communities around the country, certainly, I would say in Western Europe and in North America. So most large metropolitan areas have access to short-lived isotopes for the imaging component piece of nuclear medicine and the field. That's important because we need to have the ability to image patients to identify who's also a suitable candidate for the therapies that we're talking about. And Jack, basically hit on two big ones that, I think the big push for the expansion of the field was getting an indication in a very large cancer, right? Prostate cancer for the PSMA assets. Prior to that, they were niche in sort of endocrine-related cancers, thyroid being the sort of example of the utility of a curative therapy for the radioisotope. And then in neuroendocrine with things like Azedra, MIBG, and the neuroendocrine Lutathera, those are still, I would say, orphan indications, but now the applications are much larger than they've ever been. And the success, and to Jack's point, the lack of really nasty side effects is actually quite dramatic and obvious to the patients. And I think there's an embrace to have what we refer to at Ratio as an extension of life with quality. Having the ability to extend life with minimal side effects and have that person enjoy those extended months of life or years of life that they would get is a giant boon for this field, and is pretty unique to this field, I think, in terms of the lack of nasty side effects. So I think lots of things are happening. Isotope availability is another thing we talked about many years ago. There's always been an availability discussion in all the major conferences back in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Now we're seeing huge investments by major companies, both pharma and investing companies, technology companies, the advancement of the ability to make lutetium, other isotopes, actinium, copper, and so on. So now the demand has been shown that this can be useful and helpful to the patient populations that are much bigger, and things are scaling appropriately, and everybody's playing catch up on some level, but it's real, and it's being established by big pharma. So it's in a much better and healthier and dramatic place than it was 10 years ago.
Right. As the scope of the industry improves, what are the challenges that have come along with that, with the use of radiopharmaceuticals and the sourcing of them?
Well, certainly manufacturing is something that we always have our eye on. We're designing fit-for-use molecules that we have to manufacture that can make a radioactive drug, which is obviously like making ice cream without a refrigerator, right? You make it, and as soon as you make it and qualify it and release that batch, radioactive decay is happening, right, during this whole process. So you have certain limitations on the manufacturing capabilities itself. It's unique because you have to protect the product as well as the operator, right, the high levels of radioactivity. And then you have to make sure that the product is going to be stable for shipment and use at a location that may be a day or two away by plane or by car. So I think understanding and supporting the supply chain has been integral to the growth. I would say everybody's concerned about it in the field, but it's something that's getting the proper attention, it's getting the proper investment, and it's something that's in process. And Jack, you can certainly add to that conversation.
John just didn't give one of my favorite Babichisms, which is, you're making melting ice cream, so there's just a lot of stress. But where ultimately society's shown over and over again, this is not a new issue. We've lived through isotope shortages and so on. And where there's a will, there's a way. With capital, there's plenty of intelligent physicists out there and engineers who want to make isotope, and we're seeing that happen in real time. So it's exciting, and a lot of innovation. Nusano, a company in Salt Lake City that could be disruptive in how much radioisotope it could make, and innovation is occurring as well for the production and supply chain of these drugs. And the regulators came out, and there's really good discourse right now between the regulators, industry, and clinicians, and the academic societies. There was a big workshop last year in Bethesda. I think we are addressing, it's going to take a village to get the whole field to where we forecast it, and I think everyone's truly doing their part. It's actually great to see.
I think one other area that needs to be addressed, and I think is being addressed, is that this is a unique therapy that requires some specialized training. Not every physician can prescribe this, and not every prescription can actually administer it. So there's also a need for expansion of the capabilities of nuclear medicine departments around the country, around the globe, to actually be able to address that demand as it comes, right? So maybe in Europe, there's a lot more local use as opposed to national use. Here, not so much until things like Lutathera and Pluvicto were approved. And so this is putting more demands on departments of nuclear medicine, departments of radiology, in some cases radiation oncology, to expand their ability to do infusions, right? These are all infusion-based therapies, and have patients in infusion rooms and so on and so forth that are kitted out for the use of radioactivity.
Because awareness is increasing, are there any misconceptions that go along with that?
I think there's always misconceptions.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, right? There's radiation phobia. As I think just it's a human phobia, right? I don't think it has anything to do with anything other than, what is radiation? It's so mysterious. But I think what people fail to realize is that we're exposed to radiation constantly, right? From the sun, from the ground, from the elements that are found in rocks and, in the mantle of the earth. I mean, this is not it's not foreign in a way that you would think it's so unique, like the toxin from a strange plant from the Amazon. It's basically everywhere in the world, right? And in Scotland, it's probably higher. New York State is high. Where there's granite, where there's other things, you get radon and things permeating through the ground. So people get more exposed to this, even on a plane ride, right, cross country, across the Atlantic. But people don't think about those things, right? And so it really requires the field to educate the public as to what's the risk here, what are we talking about? And no drug that treats cancer, as far as I know, comes without any risk, right? Even chemotherapeutics have risk, right? And there's a lot of times you do therapy in patients and there's a secondary cancer from the therapy because you're trying to kill cells, right? This is not a game for the meek. So you're really looking at this. I think there's a lot of education that could happen on a public level. That'd be really helpful for people to understand the risk and the benefit of these therapies.
Yeah, I will add, John nicely alluded to what we've studied for a long time. An interesting thing, Jim, that happens is because we can measure so many things with radioactivity. I mean, radioactivity never lies. That's the beauty of radioactivity. You can always tell if something's radioactivity, how much and what type of radioactivity it is. Yeah. And so information is a blessing and a curse in some sense. Now, to be clear, actinium is an alpha emitter. It is very toxic. We're using very small amounts of it and trying to steer it to the tumor. And with that, we have to be very diligent and safe as to how we handle and execute on all that. Back to the regulators, I think that it was a very constructive discourse around, hey, for a given radioisotope, for a given drug, it's going to take us time to understand what are the long-term safety profiles. May there be long-term safety profiles. We're treating patients whose risk of death of cancer so greatly outweighs the risk of the radioactivity we're talking about that it's all about perspective. And so some of the misconceptions are that they're misconceptions, but sometimes there are unknowns, and it's going to take time to understand the implications of some of these radioisotopes. But in the patient population, we're seeing great results and great promise.
Where does the radiopharmaceutical field fit in currently with the fight against cancer?
The standard of treatment for thyroid cancer is radioactive iodine, right? So you're talking about a standard of care there. I think when it comes to, forget about other therapies, but when it comes to imaging cancer, PET FDG's cancer is standard of care in many, many cancers, right? Now, when it comes to prostate cancer management of the patients, PSMA imaging for prostate cancer has become a standard of care, right? These are now going into the guidelines. And that's true also for cardiac imaging and other types of diseases. So I think when you look at this as a whole, there's standard of care therapies and standard of care imaging in nuclear medicine that is very well established. I would say Lutathera is now an established standard of care, and the more recent data showing that it's more useful even in earlier line therapies is very helpful. Same thing with Pluvicto for prostate cancer. You start out like all drug development in oncology at the last sort of stop a patient has along their therapeutic choices, and then you try to move up to see if the therapy, if it does look good, then could it be even better earlier when the patient has a healthier, phenotype and not as much disease, right? Then can it move up earlier than that, and can it be used in combination? And we're seeing that flow. So I think we'll see standard of care for therapy, and certainly standard of care for imaging is not going to go away. If anything, will expand.
And I think we alluded to it, but it can't be stated too often that given the toxicity profile of these drugs, the great hope is to use radiopharmaceuticals in conjunction with immunotherapeutics to have more lasting remissions. John and I and the team here look every day and are always trying to sketch, and we're now participating in that movement. But I think that's really where do we hope it fits in, is in the combination, given how well patients tolerate these drugs, that they're going to improve the immunogenicity in the tumor environment and improve the outcomes of immunotherapeutics, which are great therapeutics, not without side effects. Can we convert to sustainable, long, extended life, to John's point, with quality? And that's really where these drugs could play a great role. But as it stands, of course, they're coming in at last line of care to start and then are moving up. And that's how drugs work.
I know it's the same with every particular field, but to what extent are manufacturing and regulations and distribution factors?
They're neither the hardest nor the easiest drugs to make and distribute. There are more complex problems that people have to solve, but it's certainly not a lyophilized small molecule that has a shelf life of 2 years, or it could be an oral pill that has a shelf life of multiple years. So it's somewhere in between. And as we alluded to earlier, I think the village is rising to address the problem, and that is almost exclusively a function of great large-scale enterprises like Novartis, Bayer, Eli Lilly, AstraZeneca, BMS. I don't want to leave anyone out, but those groups that really have come to the market with the right resources and infrastructure, and then simultaneously the institutional investment and then the rise of companies like ourselves who are trying to make innovative new drugs, as well as a slew of groups that are trying to be better on the supply chain. So we are cautiously optimistic. I think the landscape will evolve quickly as a lot of people have jumped into the market. And with resources, Jim, we would also add, has come a lot of intelligence. We're seeing a rise in the IQ of those participating in the market, which is always very welcome.
Could you maybe go from that general overview into what you're doing and your platforms?
Ratio Therapeutics, by name, right? We're doing radiation therapy, right? So from the point of view of what is the element or the mechanism of toxicity, it's the exposure of cells to ionizing radiation. And that's an important thing to consider, because what we need to do is to deliver a therapeutic radiation dose to tumor normal tissue never gets spared completely, but we're really looking to optimize the ratio between how much radioactivity is in the tumor versus normal tissues. We're looking to actually treat the extensive disease found in late-stage cancer patients that have disease all throughout their body, right? So there's the metastatic status, more or less. The only way you can do that with radiation is if you were to inject the radioactivity itself. And so we're making fit-for-purpose molecules, I'll get back to that carry a radioisotope that are injected intravenously that have the ability to find all the tumors in your body and hook onto those tumors and stay on the tumor long enough to deliver the radiation that the molecule is carrying. What we're also hoping to do is make it, in terms of fit for purpose, we obviously want to make it specific for the tumor, so it binds with high affinity, and the affinity is just how intensely can it bind to the tumor and how long will it stay at the tumor. Sort of the simple analogy is if you're cooking, you need to get up to temperature and you need to stay there long enough to actually affect the transition of the tissue, right? So into a raw piece of meat, into a cooked piece of meat. We want to cook the tumors. And so we need to get not only the amount of radioactivity that we inject into the body, as much of that into the tumor, so that, say, count that as the temperature. And then the time is the residence time. So we want to be able to say that we can bring that amount of radioactivity into the tissue for a sufficient amount of time to drop the payload, to impart the energy that's in those molecules to kill the tumor. And then we want the rest of the molecule to clear. The rest of the molecules that are not bound to the tumor to clear through the kidney system, through the GI tract, however it is, as fast as possible to minimize the radiation dose to those tissues. Right? We want to get a low kidney dose, we want to get a low GI dose, we want to get name the organ dose. And that's really the objective of targeted radiotherapeutics that are given intravenously. And so we have the ability to modulate some of those parameters by building molecules, and we have a couple of different platforms within the company. One of them being Trillium, where we have a binding domain that identifies the target on the surface of the tumor cell, a payload, so with a chelator, this is a molecular basket that metals like to drop into and are bound tightly so we can carry the payload. And then we have another arm, the third arm of the Trillium molecule is basically something that will reversibly bind to albumin, so we can sort of hitchhike on albumin in a very specific manner in time-wise, so that we can get more circulation of what's injected through the tumor bed to get as much on the tumor as we can. And why would it do that? Because it's about 1,000 times more attractive to bind the tumor antigen than to be on albumin. And so there's a lot of albumin in your blood. You basically see the target, and then you'll be attracted to that, jump off albumin, bind the target, and we've seen that with several of our compounds that are deep into clinical trials now. So that's fit for purpose. We also have some chelates that are unique that bind actinium, and we also have other tricks up our sleeve in terms of our ability to sort of deconstruct molecules and reconstruct them to design out some of the flaws that are in natural substances that are been taken. So our ability right now is to generate I'd say best-in-class, first-in-class discovery platform for cancers, start our early work in the clinic in phase 1 and phase 2. And obviously, we have a great discovery effort. We got a great physics effort. We got a great radiation biology group, radiation dosimetry group. We have a lot of strong scientific capabilities, as well as the ability to translate these clinically into early stage trials.
Jim, this is a pharmacokinetic sport. Pharmacokinetics, what does the body do to the drug? And we try to design the drug such that the body preferentially takes it up, as John nicely described. Pharmacodynamics is we have a better grasp on in this class of drug. We measure it, as I said, sometimes too much. And we've really built a team here, to John's point, that's interdisciplinary. And I'll just add, it's so unique and key to our platform or as a company how we do things, but the ability to kill or progress a compound with early first-in-human imaging, you can tell early if a drug doesn't have the right properties. And having worked in life on many translational programs, primarily outside of radioligand therapy, it can take so long before you actually learn and get to a go, no-go kind of decision. Here, it can happen much faster. That's really the benefit of one of the unique aspects of the field.
So where are you at on the clinical trial pathway currently?
Launching right now. We have run, as a company, we have filed 3 INDs. 2 were for imaging, 1 for therapy, and that trial is just opened, and we are cautiously optimistic that we will be able to report on, you always are skittish at these exact moments, but we're right on the precipice of having first patient dosed in the therapy trial. We've completed those imaging trials and then have a pipeline behind it. Our lead program is for a target called FAP, and respectful of time, it's an exciting target in this space, and we're specifically launching in sarcoma with a clear line of sight to launch in other indications. It's a pan-cancer target where it's highly expressed in sarcoma, a very unmet need, but we'll right away start working on other indications. We feel like that was our best shot at single agent efficacy. We have an alpha emitter, actinium, going into the clinic, and Jim, hopefully we talk to you again. We have great news to tell you about in that effort. But we have already treated patients in compassionate use with that lead program with a beta emitter, and we are cautiously optimistic that this will be more impactful, as we typically see that's the case with alpha emitters, which are more potent than beta emitters, more cytotoxic.
And so where would you say that the field of radiopharmaceuticals is going to be a few years from now, and where do you see your company sitting in that?
We actually more concretely have taken the bullseye plots that we see of every program in radiopharmaceuticals, and we took the liberty of progressing likelihood of approval, probability of success, and we forecast 15 to 20 approvals outside of PSMA and Lutathera, so for new targets. And so we think the excitement has been in what we've seen very promising results, not only for FAP in our case, but for other targets. So I think you're going to see a massive rise of the role of radiopharmaceuticals, and this infrastructure will keep rising. Our goal is to march along this lead program, and we have another program we're trying to put into patients by the end of the year. As a company, we launched the build of our manufacturing plant in Salt Lake City, a 65,000 square foot facility, preparing for what we would hope to be a downstream commercial launch. And so we're just marching along as companies exactly in our peer group do, moving this program forward, expanding. There's a blessing and a curse to having a pan-cancer target. You have to start somewhere, and then you also need to look at what's the opportunity in other indications. And then we have a program behind that we're trying to get into the clinic.
And I know that you've mentioned quality of life, which is massively important. There's no point extending somebody's life by 6 months or a year if it's just a completely miserable existence. So what do you think that the radiopharmaceutical field offers to patients ultimately? And as we move forward, how do you think that will change?
So I think the idea I tried to describe a little bit ago is really that you need to get the drug to the tumor selectively. That does a couple of things, right, that are very important. It's not to say that there is a lack of side effects, right, that could be measured. Like, sometimes your blood counts might drop and become anemic or something to that extent, because you are using radiation and it's giving throughout the body. However, the better we are as scientists and drug developers of having more ability to be selective in terms of our localization in the tumor, you basically, if you think about it, you're giving single injections, maybe 4 to 8 weeks apart, of a drug that is highly localizing in the tumor and is basically released from everything else. And so the better we get at that, and the field should become better at that, the more likely there will be less and less side effects, not zero, but less and less side effects that are debilitating. If you think about how chemotherapy is given to tolerance, right? So you're giving a therapy as much as you can give that patient can tolerate the side effects of, not the benefit of. They're given so they can tolerate the side effects, right? And sometimes that's a cumulative thing. Those side effects build up over time as you find you're worse off, right? Because you're basically flooding the body. There is no targeting per se. Even when people talk about targeted therapies, they're not physiologically targeted. They're targeted to a particular activity in a particular cell, but they're going everywhere in the body, right? And they'll have side effects based on that. But here, if you look at these things, they're given intravenously. They usually are very water soluble, and they clear very quickly if they're not going to bind, right? So now you look at this progression. So you can do that every 4 to 8 weeks without the side effect profile that you would have. If someone has to go chemotherapy every month, by the time they're on their fourth or fifth cycle, they feel like chemotherapy even worse than they would the first time, right? And I've lived through this with my partner. And so you look at this cumulative toxicity, you can't escape that from some of these therapies where this is kind of episodic, right? We have the ability to knock down the tumor with a certain profile, and that doesn't seem to be a cumulative. There doesn't seem to be any growth of the cumulative toxicity of this. So I think as people become more aware of that, it'll be much more attractive for the field of medicine, much more attractive to patients, and they may demand to have, is there a radiotherapeutic therapy that I could have as opposed to going on chemotherapy or something else? And I think to Jack's earlier point, it'll be done in combination because it'll be beneficial without adding overlapping toxicities that would be more detrimental and more intolerable earlier on. So I think this is going to play out, but I think that's what the future holds for us.
Exactly. I think chemotherapy has played a positive role in some indications and in some efforts, but by and large, I think chemotherapy is tough. And so I do think radiopharmaceuticals could play a big part long term and in a new era of cell-based, gene-based therapies as well. It's a big part of, we think, the future of cancer care.
Has the introduction of AI, that seems to be the big buzzword in the biotech field, has that impacted what you do?
The short answer is yes. But as a mathematician, I would say I really like to clarify and classify what is the actual AI. I think AI is helping all companies. We are a very data-driven company with a significant data platform that we've built. AI clearly is helping in medicinal chemistry and in imaging from a task-oriented perspective of using algorithms to better work in those fields. There is no magic, though. We're not seeing like a consumption of data and click a button and have a deep learning algorithm spit out what's the next thing to do. But I hope for all organizations in drug discovery and development, we can apply AI not only in the product side, but also in the general and administrative side to accelerate on the regulatory side. It's really taking the tools you have at hand and trying to improve the efficiency and pace of the organization.
One of the things that we're very aware of is, I'm sure your audience as well, the earlier you find a tumor, the better the outcome for the patient typically is, right? Yeah. And I think AI is showing itself within the imaging space, right? That the AI, the computer reading of images, it could actually find cancers when they're not as visible to the naked eye versus, say, a radiologist. So I think that shifts people over to a better outcome potentially, and that could also put people into a different, how do we follow up on this one? This guy looks much more, this lesion looks much more suspicious. We should do another test. Nuclear medicine might be the answer to that. The other thing that I think Jack may be alluding to as well is there is so much data that comes out of a clinical trial that it's hard to actually consume it all and digest it all. And I think while we are typically looking for endpoints and the like, there's a lot of data in there that actually could be mined, and AI might be very helpful in understanding maybe the potential for side effects, maybe the potential for recurrence, maybe the potential for a better outcome in patients, given all their blood work and all the CT scan data that they have that along the way. So I don't think we know exactly, other than there's a hell of a lot of data that gets accumulated during the course of a trial that I'm sure most of it is, you take the surface benefit of it, which is what we want. Do you live longer? Do you have a better quality of life? Those are the more obvious things. But there's probably a lot of really deep data there that we could mine that'll add value to the process and also add value to the application of the therapy.
Yeah, I think that one of the good things about AI in that respect is that we kind of tend to look at the data, but AI's got the capacity to bring in a lot of different analysis and stages of things that maybe it can pick up on patterns that we don't see because we're not even looking.
Imaging has been really the win for AI in medicine, both in radiology as well as now in pathology, though pathology remains very analog. And the case after case, there's just things where AI as a classifier can beat the human as a classifier. And so that's exciting. And I do believe, Jim, that someday, maybe it'll start in cardiology would be my guess, where we treat patients as numbers already. But I think that the day will come when the tumor board has to use AI. That there's just the amount of information flowing into a tumor board at a hospital is exceeding the capacity of of people working there. And so I think we owe it to ourselves to try to empower clinicians with better tools as well. But that is not Ratio Therapeutics' immediate task. Our immediate task is to use all the information we have at hand to make the best decisions on how to move our programs forward.
Is there anything that we didn't mention that you wanted to talk about?
I think we covered a lot. I'd say we are optimistic about our own programs and also seeing an uptick in the caliber of other programs we see across the field. My only comment, and I don't know how it fits in perfectly your podcast, we've said it, and it kind of summarizes the fact that as the field launched, there was a lot of people that showed up with an isotope and said, I have a drug, I'm just going to put it on this drug. I'm going to put it on this known drug. And there were a lot of people that showed up with some drug that failed elsewhere and said, I'm just going to slap a radioisotope on it. And that doesn't work. You have to try to design a fit for purpose nuclear medicine and pharmaceutical research. And I think that's the confluence of knowledge that needs to make this field rise. And I think if we look at where we are today compared to 5 years ago, not us, the field, it's amazing how much has occurred in that time frame to that effort. So that's what excites us.
Another nice in-depth feature, and radiopharmaceuticals is a really interesting field, certainly part of the puzzle when it comes to finding treatments for cancer. Anyway, that's it for this week's podcast. I'm no nearer to having those Lithuania interviews ready, and now there are Dublin ones too, and soon to be Nordic ones as well. But it's a good problem to have, definitely better than a podcast with no guests. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities, which we don't charge for, by the way, unlike some other podcasts, or if you want to advertise or you just want to share a good recipe, please feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. I'm even happy to talk about the other bases, the baseball ones. Tense times in the playoffs. So until next week, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening. And I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.